What you are about to hear is not a podcast. This is a global conversation recorded live in real time with real people.
Journalists,
business leaders,
academics, politicians. I think the term's a deep state. Oh dear.
Investors,
Experts, diplomats,
citizens.
Coming together from around the world to share their views and ask our guests the questions. If you would like to join this conversation or hear our incredible library of past conversations, please visit our website, pm101.club, and join the fastest growing conscious community on the free internet. Thanks for being here.
enjoy the
Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning, and if you listened to our first few episodes, then you know that over the last few months, my friend Justin Higgins and I and our friends have convened hundreds of live conversations, sometimes more than once per day, with up to 30,000 listeners and participants, where we all hear live and direct from people in the news, in their own voices, in their own words, in long form, and where anyone who wants to can join to ask them a question, share their thoughts, or just listen. We're just now starting to release recorded portions of our live conversations for the first time, and we're grateful to you for joining us. Today we're excited to release part of a conversation, interview, and audience Q&A we had with Elie Honig. Elie's a lawyer who helped to lock up more than 100 members of the mafia. He worked as a U.S. attorney during both Republican and Democratic administrations, and now works as the senior legal analyst at CNN, where he keeps a close eye on everything that's happening in the courts and uses his expertise to explain them in understandable ways to the public. In this conversation, we did a deep dive on the judiciary, what its role in our lives is and should be, and how presidents of both parties and their attorney general picks have abused the institution. Studying governments around the world, one of the things I find most interesting is how they organize their centers of power. Who makes the calls and who carries them out? Who can object? How much power is allowed to center around one person or a small group? And of course, the most important question of all, how do citizens get to have input? Who protects them and what rights do they have to protect themselves? In some countries, the military and the government are one blob that holds all the decisions and weapons and does what it wants. Here in the US, everyone's taught as a child about how we have checks and balances between our three federal power centers and branches of government. The legislative, where Congress writes the laws, the executive, where the president enforces them, and the judicial, where courts step in whenever fights arise over what the laws mean. One of the top cops in this whole system is the Attorney General, who's appointed by the president, but who takes an oath to defend the Constitution, not the president, and who's expected to be an impartial guardian of justice, and really, of fairness in the courts, across the whole country itself. We had a great conversation with Elie about this, where he was openly critical of President Obama's Attorney General, Eric Holder, and Donald Trump's Attorney General, Bill Barr. He held nothing back. It was fascinating, and we hope you enjoy it as much as we did. As always, if you like what you hear, if you want to hear more episodes, if you want to find out how to join us live almost every day of the week, maybe ask one of our upcoming guests a question, please visit our website, pm101.club, or pm101.live. They both work and will get you to the same place where you can find all that and more. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
Elie is author of Hatchet Man. It goes in to look at Bill Barr's second tenure in the DOJ as Attorney General under Trump. So I want to first get started. Everybody probably knows you, Elie, from your gig with CNN. Could you kind of walk through what you do as a senior legal analyst?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. Like I said, this is my debut appearance. A friend of mine did get me to join a while back, and then I never did anything with it. But now I'm starting to see sort of the power of it and how cool it can be. And I do love the direct interaction. So definitely encourage people to line up with questions. I'll take questions about anything you want. My whole venture into media was not at all planned. I was, like you said, I spent 14 years as a federal and state prosecutor. I love that job, but that's a long time to do it. And I started teaching at Rutgers University, which is our state university here in New Jersey, where I went 20 some years before. And I felt like I had come, in one sense, come full circle, and in another sense, made zero progress whatsoever, because my office was about 20 yards away from my freshman dorm. So I was teaching at Rutgers, and this was the summer of 2018. So sort of the height of the Mueller investigation. And a friend of mine had been doing, Mimi Roca, I can drop her name. She was a SDNY mentor of mine, and now she became a TV analyst, and now she's actually the elected district attorney of Westchester County, New York, said, would you want to do this because they need good people? I think you'd be good at it. I said, yeah, sure. It sounds fun. It'll be a charge to go on TV. And did it and really enjoyed it and did it that whole summer of 2018. And then CNN signed me as a legal analyst in the early fall of 2018. And I've been doing it ever since. So almost 3 years. What do we do? The easy answer, but it doesn't really help anything, is we go on air and we explain things. However, I'll give you a little more than that. I view my job as number one, explaining. Number one, making sure that people understand what these legal issues are and how important they are, or sometimes unimportant. Sometimes, on occasion, you'll have something where the media is going, oh, he has pled not guilty. What, it's like they all plead not guilty, So once in a while you have to say that there's nothing really, we're reading too much into this. But, the great thing one of many great things about CNN is that if there's an ethic there, it's simply this: make sure you have your facts straight, be fair, and then be yourself and let it rip. And I have really enjoyed doing that. It's been a way for me to sort of communicate with the public and teach people about our system, which I care deeply about and I write about in the book, and reach a lot of people. So I'm happy to talk. I know people have a lot of questions about when do they tell you when you're going to be on and what's this anchor like? I'll take those questions later if you want to ask them. But so I've been doing the CNN thing for not quite 3 years. And I wrote this book, which came about as a direct result. I can tell that story as well. HarperCollins, my publisher, actually reached out to me. I don't have an agent to this day. They reached out to me through Twitter, and I called them back, and we had a deal about 2 days later because this book was sort of right up my alley. I'm doing a lot of different things. I got a podcast coming, which we can talk about as well. But I do love the media life. It can be challenging and stressful, but so rewarding.
So let's get into that legal brain of yours.
Okay.
Bill Barr is controversial, right? Some people love him, some people don't. Your book is titled Hatchet Man, so I would say you're probably in the latter group. But could you kind of walk us through we're going to start broad here, his overriding judicial ideology?
Yeah, and Justin, I do want to point this out, consistent with what you were saying about the theme of this room. I did not at all start out with my hatchet out, so to speak, for Bill Barr. In fact, I quote myself in the book because I happened to be on set at CNN the day his name popped as the person who Trump was going to nominate for AG. And I asked a producer at CNN to go pull the clip because I wanted to quote myself. And I said something like, he appears to be, look, he's done the job before. He was AG back in the 90s. He's a serious person. He's a respected person. And he looks like a strong pick. So I gave Bill Barr absolutely publicly on TV the benefit of the doubt. I was not immediately gunning for this guy. He then proceeded over the next nearly 2 years, to completely destroy that faith. I realized pretty quickly that he was going to be a major problem, and he sort of got worse as he went along. His overarching legal, if we just sort of keep it at a legal level, his overarching legal philosophy, I guess, is what you'll hear sometimes called the unitary executive. And that's a theory that's existed for a long time. And basically, the idea is that the executive branch is and should be more powerful than the other branches, Congress and the courts, and that the president isn't just the most powerful person in the executive branch, but he is the executive branch, and the executive branch is him. So which includes the Justice Department. Bill Barr is sort of that theory, but taken to an outrageous extreme. And I go back through in the book through some of his earlier writings and things he said publicly. He took it to the point where the president would be utterly above the law, utterly untouchable while in office. Forget about not even being able to indict the guy, but you can't investigate him. You can't subpoena him. You really can't do anything in Bill Barr's view. Now, Bill Barr got his butt kicked in the courts constantly because he was out too far. He was too legally extreme. So that's his legal point of view. I also talk a bit in the book, quite a bit in the book, about Bill Barr's personal philosophical point of view, which I think animated him as well, Justin.
Do you want to just get into that really briefly? Yeah. Maybe the religious impacts.
Yeah.
What you're talking.
Yeah, I mean, so I knew going in, it was obvious. I mean, Bill Barr was explicit about the fact that he had this sort of legal view. But one thing that really shocked me in the research for this book is that Bill Barr is a true old school, what I call culture warrior, meaning this has nothing to do with the fact that Bill Barr is or is not religious. I actually don't even know what his personal religious practice is. I mean, I know he's Catholic, but I don't know if he goes to church or is active or not. I don't care. What is relevant is that Bill Barr, we found old things that he had written and said in speeches that show that Bill Barr believes, and I quote Bill Barr here, God's law, end quote, should be the supreme law of the land, of the government. He says that Judeo-Christian teachings are the only reasonable principle to organize our society and our government. He at times rails against what he calls, and I quote, the homosexual movement, what he calls militant secularists. And he says those things and others are to blame for the downfall of society, the collapse of the family and depression and violence and all of that. And he also thinks of it in really, and talks about it in militaristic terms. He says, what is our strategy? I'm paraphrasing here. I put the quote in the book. What is our strategy for the church to regain its proper place at the top of society? How will we retake the battlefield and fight uphill? And I think that animated him a lot as well. And one of the distinctions I draw in the book, Justin, is I think that unlike a lot of Trump's sort of most loyal sycophants, think Matt Gaetz or Jim Jordan or Stephen Miller, he didn't, I don't believe based on his actions that Bill Barr viewed Donald Trump as some mystical, sort of all-knowing, all-powerful being. I think Bill Barr viewed and used Donald Trump more as a vessel, as a vehicle, as a guy who was roughly aligned with his thinking about the all-powerful presidency, but someone through whom Bill Barr could sort of realize this next level of power.
Perfect. And could you kind of go into, so for the audience, Bill Barr had a stint as AG in the early 90s. Could you go into maybe just what you were saying about how he viewed Trump as a vessel, and this is an opportunity to push his own values about judicial philosophy and his world outlook, and kind of compare and contrast from a philosophical or ideological level his first stint as AG to what many would characterize as a more extreme and more prominent role this second time?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I get a lot. So Bill Barr is actually one of two people in United States history ever to serve as AG twice. The first was a guy in the 1840s and 50s. I'm blanking on his name. It's in the book, though, so in case it ever comes up on Jeopardy, you'll know it. But Bill Barr, and not only was he AG twice, but there was 25 years in between. He was AG from 91 to early 93 under George H.W. Bush. And people say, what happened in between those times? I mean, if you reflect back on Barr's first term, and I spend a little bit of time, not much, but basically I conclude he came out of his first term as AG more or less like every AG, right? Whether it's Eric Holder or Alberto Gonzalez or John Ashcroft or Dick Thornburg, any of the modern AGs where they have, look, any AG is going to have their dust-ups, going to have their controversies, but nothing major, nothing that anybody thought, wow, this guy's an extremist, nothing that anybody wrote a book about him back in the 90s. His biggest controversy was probably the Iran-Contra scandal, where he advocated for pardons for some of the well-connected people around the president and vice president, including Caspar Weinberger, who was defense secretary. That ended up being a bit of foreshadowing for what would happen later. But then he gets in his second term, and it's a completely different ballgame. He's absolutely extremist. He's angry. He's arrogant. He's aggressive in the way he uses his power. And I think I have a two-part answer to sort of what changed. One is I think our politics changed. I mean, those who are old enough, I mean, I'm barely old enough. I was in high school in the early 90s. But, think about what life was like or politics were like 91, 92, 93. I mean, sure, there were divides, but nothing like what we have in the era of Trumpism. And so I think our politics became more extreme. And I think Bill Barr became more extreme. I mean, we all change. Think of what you were like 91, 92, 93 to now. I'm a bit different. I'm sure everyone is. But I think Barr realized this was his last chance, right? When he took the job, he was 68 years old. He tried to put on this bogus persona of, oh, I don't need this job during his confirmation. I'm half retired. He was worth, we did some research. He was worth tens of millions of dollars at the time because he had all these lucrative private sector gigs. $40 million is the best estimate of what he was worth. So why would he do this? Because it was his last lunge at power. And he sought it out. Remember, he wrote that audition memo before he became AG saying basically Mueller's investigation is fatally misconceived. Trump got wind of that memo and then was like, this is my guy. So Barr sought out that power. Don't buy his whole reluctantly dragged into public service routine. And he saw it as his last chance to really to both exercise his legal extremism, that Federalist Society, unitary executive idea, plus his culture warrior approach. And I think if you look at Trump, Trump and Barr were simpatico on a lot of things. I mean, starting with Donald Trump needs to be protected at all costs, even if it means lying, even if it means twisting the law. Barr did that plenty of times. But even more generally, we talk about the unitary executive and Federalist Society. That's the sort of fancy way to put it. But remember, Donald Trump himself said a couple times, he said at one point, we're fighting all the subpoenas. At another point, he said, I can do whatever I want. I have an Article 2. I'm not sure he understands what Article 2 is. But those are just less sophisticated, less academic ways of saying the same thing that Bill Barr believed. So I think they were sort of aligned in an unusual way there.
Elie, you said that our politics have changed. We're in a partisan atmosphere, and Bill Barr kind of embodied that and really took advantage of it. I want to get into one of the most partisan things that we can discuss, unfortunately, the Mueller report.
Yep.
So Bill Barr comes into office, and this thing is full steam ahead. It is underway. When the report was delivered to Bill Barr, the Attorney General made several key decisions that shaped the public's perception of this report. And as everybody knows, it's hundreds of pages. I didn't even go through and read the full thing until a couple of months later. So it's not like the public is reading this thing and drawing their own conclusions. Can you go into what these choices were and the impact that they had?
Yeah, the timing is really important here. So first of all, like I said, when Bill Barr is auditioning for this job as Attorney General, so it's the middle of 2018. It's clear at this point, if you remember, that the AG job was going to be open, because at this point, Trump is openly berating, humiliating Jeff Sessions every day, saying he's spineless and a coward and dumb. I mean, I still can't believe that the Attorney General of the United States took that kind of abuse without standing up for himself. It made me a little crazy as a DOJ alum. But it was obvious that job was going to be open. Bill Barr writes this memo, unsolicited, nobody asked him for it, saying that Mueller's obstruction investigation was, and I quote Bill Barr, fatally misconceived. Fatally means dead, right? DOA. Donald Trump, we now know through some reporting by Jonathan Swan, my friend over at Axios and others, got wind of this memo and his eyes lit up, right? I mean, Donald Trump had always been moaning, where's my Roy Cohn? Well, here's Bill Barr saying the exact right thing. I'll be your Roy Cohn. I'll make sure this thing goes away. Okay, Barr gets the job. Bill Barr is the very first person, March 22nd, I believe, 2019, to get the Mueller report. Mueller's team finishes. They send it over to the AG. 2 days later, a weekend later, the same weekend he gets it, Sunday night, March 24th, Bill Barr issues his infamous 4-page letter. It's a summary. For some reason, Bill Barr and his defenders think it's some great excuse to say it's not a summary. I don't care what you call it. I mean, it is a summary, but you can call it, you can call it whatever you want. It's a 4-page letter where Bill Barr completely distorts the Mueller report. In the letter, in the 4-page letter, Bill Barr cuts one sentence in half. He leaves in the part of the sentence that says, there's not enough evidence to charge a specific conspiracy crime between the president and Russia. He cuts out the first half of that sentence, which says, although Russia committed crimes to interfere in the 2016 election, they did it because they wanted Trump to win, and the Trump campaign knew about and expected to benefit from that criminal interference. And elsewhere, he says, and they had dozens of attempts between the Trump campaign and Russia to try to connect. So he leaves out all that bad stuff. He also, Bill Barr, decides in this letter on his own to say, I find there's no obstruction of justice. Mueller didn't conclude, but I find there's no obstruction, which is just straight up wrong. And to this day, Bill Barr has never explained his thinking in any kind of compelling way. He just sort of cleared the table and said no obstruction. So here's what's even more devious, though. Do you remember, does anyone here remember how long that 4-page letter had the stage all to itself? Bill Barr held back the Mueller report from us for 27 days, almost a full month, because he said he was doing redactions. I've done redactions. There's no way that thing would take 27 days. And by the way, a federal judge later found that was bogus. So Bill Barr holds back the actual report. We can't cross-check him. We can't fact-check him for 27 days, and it's over, right? In those 27 days, in the first day, 2 days after his letter, Trump declared complete victory. All the right-wing media declared complete victory. A lot of media on both sides declared complete victory for Trump. Every follower of Trump declared complete victory. Then when the report came out, we all said, well, hang on, not we all, but people who read it carefully said, hang on, this is a very different story. And what's even more devious is that Mueller had given Barr summaries that were already scrubbed. They were already redacted, 7-page summaries for each of the 2 parts of the report saying, hey, Bill Barr, you were supposed to release these. I did these. These are my summaries of my own work. And Bill Barr chose not to release those, instead gave us his own slanted BS. And I think by doing that, he really saved Trump's hide.
At the DOJ, for everybody in the audience, there are politically appointed people that tend to switch based on the president. So they go from Republican under Trump to Democrat under President Biden. And then there are career folks. You just described this as being basically a travesty. And a lot of people have. What responsibility do the career folks have to put their foot down and say, no?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, quickly on Mueller. Look, Mueller's a hero, an American hero. I mean, because of his military service, his law enforcement service. I am critical of Mueller because he failed to state a conclusion about obstruction when I believe not only he should have, but I think he was supposed to. If you look at the special counsel regulations, they say the special counsel is supposed to state his prosecutorial or non-prosecutorial decisions and explain them. And Mueller just dodged that. I think he was being sort of old-fashioned and reticent and counting on everyone to do their jobs. But he wasn't counting on Bill Barr to come in and completely spin this thing. You know, here's the thing I want to point out. Of course, any attorney general is chosen by the president. That's a political appointment. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. And people say, well, Obama had Holder. Holder said he was Obama's wingman. Yeah, I mean, it's a stupid thing for Holder to say, a wrong thing for Holder to say. But of course, any president's going to pick an AG from his own party who's ideologically aligned, who he trusts, the president trusts, will do a good job. However, what Bill Barr did was separate and apart from and leagues beyond anything that any of the 3 Republican AGs I worked under or the 1 Democratic AG I worked under ever did in the following respects. 1, he lied. Bill Barr lied to the public so many times. I mean, I knew of 3 or 4 offhand, but as I went through the book, I kept finding even these small little lies that he gave us in the public. That is completely beyond the pale for any attorney general. And the other thing is, Barr injected politics not just into DOJ's policies. I don't necessarily have a problem with that. If a president says, hey, I want to emphasize, stronger or weaker border enforcement or stronger or weaker monitoring of police departments, that's fine. But when politics start to enter into individual prosecutions, the Mueller investigation of Trump, the Stone case, the Flynn case, that's where I draw the line. What are line-level folks supposed to do? When I say line-level folks, I mean like I was. People at U.S. attorneys' offices trying cases on the front lines. By and large, your job is just to keep your head down and do your job. And that's 99 point whatever percent of DOJ, and those are the people who kept DOJ on its feet and who will allow DOJ to recover. I was one of them once, and I have countless friends who are that now. I don't believe that if you're just a line level assistant like I was, you have some responsibility to speak out against the attorney general. It's not your job unless and until you are asked to do something inappropriate, unethical, or you are directly undermined by the AG. And that is why, Justin, we saw what I believe has to be a world's record. 7 different career federal prosecutors resigned off of 4 different cases because of Bill Barr's political interference. Stone, Flynn, Durham, and then when Barr changed the rules on election fraud cases at the very end, leading up to the election. So that speaks loudly to me. That shows me that Bill Barr stepped over sort of some of those lines, some of which are unwritten, some of which are written, but any real prosecutor understands.
Elie, you touched on Eric Holder, and I do want to bring him up. Yeah. So for everybody in the audience, you can go back decades, I'm sure, but at least since 9/11 and the Patriot Act was passed under George W. Bush, the executive branch's encroachment under George W. Bush, under President Obama, and under President Trump have been flagrant and I would say existential threats to our checks and balances. One example of this is Eric Holder. I was interning in Congress. He ultimately defied and stonewalled congressional subpoenas, just like we saw, and I'm sure you'll get into right now, under Bill Barr. Not only did he defy and stonewall congressional subpoenas, folks, that is a congressional request for information so that they can carry out their constitutional duty and perform oversight over the executive branch. He was voted in a resolution to be held for contempt, and it wasn't just on partisan lines. It was 17 Democrats voted with all these Republicans, and that motion did pass. So in your book, you go into Bill Barr's stonewalling of Congress and congressional subpoenas. How is it different, or is it the same from what Eric Holder did?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a great example. And by the way, it's timely because we're going to have these battles very soon when it comes time for the January 6th Select Committee to start subpoenaing. I don't know if you happen to see it, but I did a preview piece on this for CNN on Friday about how this is going to play out. You know, we could see subpoenas dropped on people like Kevin McCarthy, Jim Jordan, Mark Meadows, Jared Kushner. And if they defy it, then Congress is going to have to go through its sort of tool bag of options, one of which is contempt. And I threw up on the board, the magic wall thing that, where you press the buttons and things pop up. I said, here are some examples of people who've been held in contempt in recent years. Bill Barr was one. Eric Holder was also up on my screen for the exact incident you talk about. Eric Holder's conduct was indefensible. It was inexcusable. It was wrong. I would have voted for contempt on him if I was in Congress back in 2012, just like Bill Barr's was in 2019. His related to a refusal to turn over information relating to DOJ's sort of spurious questions on the census.
Furious.
Yeah. Holder was fast and furious. Bill Barr was on the census. Yeah. And they were both, so let me put it this way. Both of those refusals and both of them being held in contempt were equally wrong and inexcusable. The difference is Eric Holder kept with the norm that AGs of both parties, except for in this instance, of if they got a subpoena from Congress, would do what we call the sort of the negotiation, we call the accommodation process. You go back and forth, just like any lawyers would over any subpoenas. Well, we'll give you this, but not that. Okay, how about you give us A and B, but not C? Okay, fine, done deal. Eric Holder was willing to do that, did do that. Bill Barr just put up a stop sign. Bill Barr just said no. Bill Barr just put into action Donald Trump's, we're fighting all the subpoenas. I have a second Article 2. I can do whatever I want. So it is a matter of degree. And Bill Barr went way farther. And I think Holder's also a useful example because, again, as you can tell, I'm no Holder apologist by any means. But people go, oh, but Holder had Fast and Furious. I go, yeah, he did. And Holder said he was wingman. Okay, good. So there's chapter 1.5. What are your next 15 chapters? Because I got 15 on Bill Barr. And so, again, arguing other AGs have been bad, have done bad things, have not been perfect, that's fine, that's legit. But that doesn't mean everyone's on the same level. And Bill Barr, the seriousness and the frequency of his violations of, I believe, law and ethics and norms goes beyond anything we've seen.
Well, I think that question, because Elie, I've listened to you all the time. I just haven't heard you on TV go into it. So I think it's really important to kind of set that stake in the ground that this isn't just a Republican or Democrat thing, that you're being consistent here with how we're kind of interpreting things. So
Look at my piece that I did for CNN. I did it Friday morning. It's on my Twitter. You'll see examples of contempt. I say, here's Eric Holder. Here's Bill Barr. Here's, I think, Wilbur Ross was the other person. So anyway, yeah.
I think we should bring back the Sergeant of Arms and just throw these people in jail.
People do ask for that. That's a common question. I have an inbox for CNN where I take questions for cross-exam. This thing I do on the weekends where I answer viewer questions directly. And everyone wants that. I don't know. Can you imagine? always tell people, like, it just ain't going to happen. It's not going to happen since it didn't happen since the 1930s. But imagine like some sergeant at arms slapping handcuffs on Jim Jordan or something. I mean, it's just, there's actually a funny or an interesting historical debate about like where the prison was where they used to hold people. We do know there was a prison offsite, but there's all these, someone should do like a Da Vinci Code about this, like, the secret prison in Congress where they used to hold people who were in contempt.
I think that would be awesome, especially as the interns give the tours of the building.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have one more question. If you're in the audience, we will get to you. So just raise your hand if you have any questions. Kind of looking at maybe a situation that could have been a lot worse.
Yeah.
Elie, I'm going to transport you and the audience. It's the day after the election, and President Trump lost. Obviously, Fox News called Arizona, but he clearly lost. It was a secure election, free and fair. But there were a lot of different shenanigans going on, and General Miley is quoted in a different book. You wrote Hatchet Man. He's quoted in a book from two Washington Post authors talking about how dire this situation got. Can you go into what Bill Barr ultimately did and how he reacted to the demands that were being placed on the DOJ, and maybe it'll kind of end in his resignation?
Yeah, so Bill Barr did have an interesting sort of turnabout at the last minute, or maybe beyond the last minute. When it was clear that Donald Trump had lost the election, which was, to most sane people, it was a few days after the election itself when all the major networks and data sources called it for Joe Biden. But 3 weeks after that, Bill Barr sort of had his big, moment of bravery, I guess. I'm putting bravery in quotation marks there, when he publicly declared, and by the way, he didn't have to do this. There was no occasion for him to do this, but he felt it important enough to go out on his own, and he did an interview with the AP, and he said, we have not found evidence of widespread voter fraud. And Trump flipped out and sort of, wrote him off at that point. Bill Barr's out there now doing an image rehab tour. By the way, he's very sensitive about his public image, where he's reminding us all that he did that. And he did. And I put that in my book, yes, in December. And he did the right thing there. However, what Bill Barr's leaving out of this story is that for 6 months leading up to the election, he went on national TV, he went on national radio, he went in front of Congress, and he absolutely fanned the flames of the big lie. He said there's this huge risk of counterfeit ballots coming in from overseas. We'd be helpless to police it. There's nothing we can do where there's so we have to, let's get the whole story here. Did Bill Barr at the very end game, when he was trying to avoid being sort of lumped in with the Rudys and the Sidney Powells and salvage his own reputation, and maybe even to just do the right thing, did he stand up to the president then in December? Sure. But had he already helped to set the House on fire? Absolutely. We cannot ignore that. So let's get the whole story here. Let's not just allow Bill Barr. And I was a little bit miffed. I mean, it's good for my book, I guess, but he did this interview the week before my book came out with The Atlantic, with John Karl, where I don't know how John Karl doesn't raise that, but Bill Barr gives us the whole dramatic story, how he stands up to Trump. I kept reading the article going, well, at some point they have to mention that Barr, went on NPR, went on CNN, went in front of Congress and fanned the flames of the big lie. That's being left out. I don't know why. Maybe it's access journalism, but that's an important part of the story that we need to know.
I promise to not comment on my thoughts on a cable news network letting reputation laundering happen relatively unchecked. So we will just put a pin in that, go to the audience. So I want to go first to Greg Sattel, and then I want to go to Donna Patterson.
Thanks so much, Justin, and thanks, Elie, for joining us. So you and many others have remarked about how Barr and Trump just sort of laid waste to norms at the Justice Department, which generally speaking is a bad thing. But isn't it also a opportunity to reevaluate norms and values? And how do you see the current administration sort of moving the Department of Justice forward? Is it sort of back to where it was, or is it going in maybe a different direction?
Yeah, great question, Greg. So yeah, this is what I call the prosecutor's code in the book. And I talk about how there's plenty of written rules you have to know and obey and follow if you're a prosecutor, the rules of evidence and the statutes. But there's also this thing, all the unwritten rules, the norms, the principles that you just learn by doing, by being an actual prosecutor, which I did. And Bill Barr never did. And I think that was one of the things that really limited his view. Basic things. You never lie. It's ridiculous that should have to be said, but it does for Bill Barr. You never even fudge the truth. You never exaggerate. If you have a bad fact, you put it out there and you deal with it. You never undercut your colleagues. You take yourself out of any case where you have any potential conflict of interest and so on. And I argue that Bill Barr destroyed those things. I guess you're right. I think it's a fair point that not all norms and principles have to be set in stone forever. I mean, a lot of the progress in American history has come from questioning and updating and maybe discarding some of those norms and values. I think the ones I write about in the book are fairly long-term and fairly durable. But yeah, I'm always up for a re-examination. Merrick Garland has taken an interesting approach that I've been critical of in getting DOJ back on its feet. It seems, although he's been changing this just even in the last couple of days, but for a while it seemed like Merrick Garland's approach to everything was, will this be perceived as a shot against Barr and Trump? If so, do opposite. And I thought that by trying so hard to stay out of anything politically turbulent, he was actually playing politics in just as bad of a way by just trying to keep everything, by automatically going to whatever side would be the path of least resistance. It's not your job as a prosecutor. That said, he's taken some stronger stands, even just the other day when he decided, for example, DOJ would not be representing Mo Brooks in relation to January 6th. And when he decided that the tax returns needed to go over to Congress because that's what the law obviously says. So I think Garland has a difficult, cleanup job in front of him. I think he's generally doing a decent job. Most importantly, he and Joe Biden have clearly reestablished the wall of separation between DOJ and the White House when it comes to specific prosecutions. That's one of the reforms I advocate for in the book, and they've actually now officially adopted it, not because of me. I mean, it was fairly obvious, but that wall of separation did not exist and was not respected between Trump and Barr. They viewed one another as sort of interchangeable and, doing one another's will. But there needs to be that wall of separation. So I think that's an important guideline, or principle, really, that Garland has reestablished for DOJ.
Donna, over to you. Great to see.
Good to see you. And thanks, Justin and Ellie. This has been an interesting discussion. You've condensed so much from Bush to Trump into 30 minutes. I don't have much of a question because Justin actually trumped me on the last question because I was going to ask you about kind of voter integrity and election integrity.
Yeah.
Because when you started off, what I was going to ask, because I was thinking, I remember Barr in last summer and all of these statements about mail-in ballots and then the shift that happens after the election.
Yeah, Donna, so that's actually a good question. I do want to talk. Thank you for that. I want to talk a bit about what's happening. So a lot of what we're seeing right now is a lot of state legislatures, and candidly only Republican state legislatures, using the big lie as really a pretext to go in and issue restrictive state voter laws. Now, some aspects of these laws are I don't think unduly restrictive, but some of them are. And people say, well, what can be done to stop this? And there's really only two answers. One is challenges in the courts. And we've seen DOJ, Merrick Garland, has started to challenge these. DOJ has challenged the Georgia law, for example. It's going to be an uphill climb, though, to be realistic about it. I mean, the Supreme Court, just a few weeks ago, the last day of its most recent term, came out with a 6-3 opinion upholding restrictive voter laws in Arizona. I think, generally speaking, the federal courts are going to side with the states here. The other possibility is federal legislation, which, again, Donna, to use the same term as you, trumps state legislation. If in other words, so if a state says we're going to have no early voting, but federal legislation says all states shall have at least 48 hours of early voting, I'm making this up, then the federal legislation wins out. Here's the disconnect, though. Here's where the Democrats' rhetoric does not match up with action. Joe Biden is saying very extreme things, right? Jim Crow 2.0. I mean, think about that. Let's not trivialize Jim Crow here. He's saying this is the most serious threat to our democracy since the Civil War. However, Joe Biden is not willing to advocate getting rid of the filibuster to do that. And to me, the analogy is like if I told you this house that you and I are in right now is on fire. It is going to burn down. It is that serious. And that window over there, that's the only way out. However, I'm not willing to kick out that window. Now, there's only really two conclusions here. Either I'm a crazy person, which I don't think Joe Biden is, or I don't really believe the house is on fire to the extent that I've told you. And I think there's no other logical conclusions, right? Either Joe Biden is nuts, which he's not, or he doesn't actually believe it's the biggest threat to the republic since the Civil War, because if he did, he'd absolutely be willing to change the filibuster. I mean, if aliens came down and were threatening our country and we needed to free up funding or something, and you needed to this is not a great example, but if we had a true existential threat, and the only way to solve it was by changing the filibuster, he would change the filibuster. So Democrats are oftentimes much better at the rhetoric than the action, and I think we're seeing that here.
Jefferson, over to you.
Thanks, Justin. I appreciate it. Elie, thanks for being here today.
Yeah.
My question is maybe a little vague. It's certainly not into the real nuts and bolts of things. What it looks to me like we have not just in this country, but maybe across all of Western civilization, just a severe distrust of institutions building. And it's not something that's just happened in the last 4 years. I mean, it's been getting worse and worse and worse. And not just governmental institutions, a lot of our cultural ones. I mean, you pretty much can pick a group of people in a state of unrest, and they're making eye contact with at least one institution that doesn't understand what their actual concerns are. I appreciate that there are folks who, like you, are attached or embedded in a lot of our news organizations, news institutions. But I find myself, I cannot bring myself to pay attention to any of them anymore. Yours, Fox News,
Sure.
Any of these, and I don't know what it would take to get that trust back. Like to restore that, I don't know what it would take, and I'm curious if you have any ideas.
Yeah. That's a good question. And by the way, this one thing that I love about this format is actually getting to hear people's voices. I wasn't sure how the questions would come in, but everything I do is like written. I'll get emails or so it's very cool. At Jefferson, we could even hear birds and traffic and crickets. So I know where you're at.
Right.
So first of all, with respect to sort of disenchantment with the media, I guess all I would do is urge you and other people not to disconnect. Take in media from various sources. Use your own critical lens. Look, I'm admittedly a homer, but I see how careful CNN is. I see what our reporting has to go through in order to make it onto air or onto our webpage. And I do think CNN is straightforward and is trustworthy, of course, because I work there. But also, there's a lot of other media sources that you may not know of the tip of your tongue, like CNN or Fox News or MSNBC or something like that. For example, Axios, I mentioned before, is outstanding. Watch their show. I have no connection with them. I mean, I'm friendly with those guys, but I'm not a part of it. Their HBO show is outstanding. The reporting is outstanding. I mean, even some of the stuff, there's people you can follow on Twitter who are really good. So try to cultivate your following, but I would urge you to do that rather than disengage. On the trust point, I think you're right. I agree with that. I do agree that it's gotten worse under the Trump years. And that's why I feel so strongly about DOJ. I always believe, look, I'm a DOJ purist, and I always believe that DOJ is one institution above all others that the American people can and should be able to just trust. Just if DOJ says it, and I've told this story before, but I think the first speech I ever got when I started at the SDNY when I was 29 years old, scary as that is, that I was a federal prosecutor at 29 with all that power and responsibility, was basically, people are going to trust you when you stand up in court and say, Elie Honig for the United States. Juries will trust you. Judges will trust you. The public will trust you. The media will trust you. Not because you're Elie Honig. No one knows you. No one cares about you. But because you're with the Department of Justice. And we have built that reservoir of trust. Ironically, Jim Comey was one of the ones who used to give this speech, who himself violated that trust because he felt, he has a higher calling. Jim Comey knows whatever Jim Comey believes is fine, but I'm on a detour here. And I think Bill Barr's conduct, I think his lies really damage that. And I think that's why I think it's so important that this book be written and that we get DOJ back on its feet, because we just saw, right, Donald Trump begging DOJ, guys, just come on, just say it was fraudulent and I'll take it from there. And they refused. Even Jeffrey Rosen, who I'm critical of in the book, absolutely did the right thing there when he refused. So DOJ to me is sort of a last bastion or a highest bastion of truth and trust.
I'd love your thoughts on Barr's role in executing Trump's enemies list, specifically his role leading the antitrust investigations against Google and Facebook, since that's really, not the role of the Attorney General. It's usually the role of that would have been Makin Delrahim's role. One interesting fact that many reporters have often glossed over, at least, during Barr's tenure, was the point that you made earlier in the introduction about Barr, which is his background and how he, which I believe is a really important point, was how he carried out his own agenda, right?
Yeah.
Do you think that his previous life as a telecom general counsel and that B2B conflict with the telcos in Silicon Valley was really advantageous for the Trump enemies list?
It's interesting. I will tell you guys, I don't think I've said this before, but I was booked at one point to speak to Verizon, to their legal department. And then when the title of this book came out, they were like, we're going to have to cancel. I said, yeah, I get it. Bill Barr was general counsel there, as you note, Monique, for several years. And so has a lot of friends and allies there. The movement against, or at least the increased legal scrutiny that is coming to social media and antitrust cases, whether it's Google, Amazon, et cetera, that's actually a rare issue of bipartisan agreement, maybe for different reasons, but both sides, Democrats sort of inherently distrust very large, powerful businesses. And I'm generalizing here. Republicans feel like they're persecuted by these places and kicked off Twitter and, silenced and de-emphasized and that kind of thing. So I actually don't have a problem with an attorney general carrying out a president's policy agenda when it comes to that kind of thing, right? Different presidents, I don't have any problem with saying, I'm going to be stronger antitrust or I'm going to ease off of antitrust. I'm going to come down hard on the big conglomerates or I'm going to go easier on the big conglomerates. To me, that's all fair play and sort of not the criticism that I have of Bill Barr. My criticism is twofold. One, it's the injection of politics into specific criminal cases, U.S. versus Michael Flynn versus Roger Stone, et cetera. And it's also something that you said sort of reminded me. One of Bill Barr's tendencies was to, no matter what, no matter the cost of truthfulness or sort of his own integrity, Bill Barr would mimic and mock whatever Donald Trump's political talking point of the moment was. The big lie being the worst of the bunch, but also some other ridiculous ones. You remember there was this moment when Donald Trump sort of suggested that people might try to vote twice. And Bill Barr was on with Wolf Blitzer, and Wolf asked him, obviously, Mr. Attorney General, you can't vote twice. And Bill Barr said, well, I'm not sure what the law says. And Wolf was kind of like, are you kidding me? And Wolf just goes, you can't vote twice. I mean, of course, Bill Barr knows that, but he didn't want to say it because Donald Trump had said the opposite, right? There was another incident where there was some talk. Trump was even flirting openly. I think he was more just trolling people, but with the idea of pushing back the election because of COVID, the election date. And Barr was asked that. And Bill Barr said, well, I don't know. I'd have to look and see what the Constitution says about that. I mean, the Constitution says no. It says Congress can only do that. So Bill Barr had this tendency to say things that were ridiculous or embarrassing or humiliating or just wrong, just to sort of be in line with Donald Trump. And that I think is embarrassing for DOJ as well.
Thank you for that question, Monique. We will go to Mr. John Gunnison, and then after John, we'll go to Bilal down at the bottom.
And, there's a million things I could ask you, but, would love to hear, you comment on how the misunderstanding of the MLAT process led to so much confusion about how people should understand the Zelensky phone call, for example. I think I'm most interested to discuss and hear you comment on is about the Halkbank case, which is, as some people may be aware, is the largest ever U.S. Sanctions prosecution against a Turkish bank who was funneling billions of dollars into Iran and violation of U.S. sanctions. I think that when Bill Barr tried to work to force Jeff Berman out of the SDNY, U.S. Attorney's Office, this got a little bit in the news. But in general, in comparison to all the issues about Russia and Ukraine, there's just an incredible dearth of understanding, knowledge, and even awareness of this issue. And as we kind of assess the maximum pressure campaign on Iran, it's really remarkable that people aren't considering how the Trump administration and Attorney General Barr worked so hard to actually undermine U.S. sanctions on Iran. And now that we're seeing these investigations into Giuliani that are linked to his work as lobbyist for Reza Zarrab, who's one of the culprits in that case, people are really learning for the first time about the Hulk Bank issue. And when Giuliani's eventually indicted, we're going to have a lot of catching up to do to explain to the public. So could you maybe comment on, to what extent we should really think about this case, how it's been so missing in the media coverage, and what we really need to communicate to the public so that they understand what's really occurred here, how it compares to the issues about Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah, this is one of the by far lesser known, lesser understood, lesser appreciated incidents of the Trump Barr era. I write about it in the book. I'm going to try to sort of boil it down, but Halk Bank, which is a Turkish-based bank, and several Turkish officials came under investigation by the SDNY because they were helping to get around our sanctions on Iran. They were helping people basically disguise transactions so they could continue doing business with Iran when that was against our sanctions. And this became extremely political. The president of Turkey, Erdogan, urged Joe Biden publicly, and he admitted it, to fire Preet Bharara, who was my boss at the time when this investigation really got underway. Now, Biden refused to do it. And then Erdogan started lobbying the Trump campaign, and Trump assured him, don't worry, I'm going to take care of these guys. I'm going to get rid of these guys. Barr also opposed bringing criminal charges against Halk Bank, but my old office, the SDNY, did it anyway, which I think is a great testament to the SDNY's independence, which I also write about in the book. We're not completely independent of DOJ, but in a lot of key respects, we are. That was a case that Bill Barr fought against. That was a case where Donald Trump made political promises to a foreign leader, arguably an adversarial foreign leader, to fire prosecutors and to control what DOJ did. And I think that's a perfect example of the danger of politicizing DOJ. And I think it's a great example of how Barr was there to sort of carry out Donald Trump's will. And by the way, we all remember it was about a year ago when Bill Barr fired Jeffrey Berman late on a Friday night, which isn't exactly when you do things that you think are super kosher and you're proud of. And he lied to us about it, by the way. Another incident of Bill Barr lying. He said, Jeffrey Berman is stepping down as SDNY U.S. Attorney. And about an hour or two later, Jeffrey Berman said, no, I'm not. Not that I'm aware of. And why Barr would try to lie about that, who knows? I guess he hoped that Berman would just sort of slink away. But to his credit, Berman was not willing to do that. The next day, they fired him. And Trump said, well, now I've asked Donald Trump to fire him. And he has. And then Donald Trump was asked, did you have anything to do with firing Berman? And Trump said no. So one of them, again, is lying. But they got rid of Berman 5 months before the election, which I think is unprecedented. And I think a lot of that reason is because SDNY didn't always listen to Bill Barr, as the Halk Bank case exemplifies, and had a whole bunch of active cases, including against Rudy, that if they broke, could have really harmed Donald Trump. Rudy is in a tough spot here. Will he be indicted? We don't know. I think, people always ask me, what are the chances of Gates, Rudy, and Trump being indicted? I always say, if I had to ballpark it, I would say Gates, very, very likely. Rudy is about a coin flip, and Trump is unlikely, all things considered. Rudy could be in trouble here. Rudy was tied up in that case. Rudy was representing some of the parties. He's making trips over there. As often happens with Rudy, he's got this sort of confusing hybrid role as a party and a lawyer. He was actually, I quoted in the book, it was remarkable, a federal judge in the SDNY, Richard Berman, no relation to Jeffrey Berman, openly criticized Rudy during the pendency of the case in a media interview, said it's sort of outrageous that Rudy's, trying to play all these different sides of this thing, which was like a real, a shocker to see a judge say that. So you're right. There is more story to be told here, but it's one of the lesser appreciated, I think, scandals of this era.
We'll do two quick questions.
Yeah, let's do speed round, lightning round.
Yep.
Here we go.
So we're going to get, we said Bilal, and then Evan will be our last question here.
Let's say going forward, what type of, let's let's say, I know you briefly talked about like specifically for voting, that would come out of federal legislation, but what would you see going forward as far as either federal legislation or ways to like take these norms and try to make them more practical? That way they cannot get abused by, let's say, future leaders or politicians.
You're right. We can never take our democracy for granted and just assume it will last forever, because none of them have, very few, if any, government systems have lasted this long, this successfully. And so we have to work at it. In the book, I lay out 9 different proposals, specifically geared at DOJ and keeping DOJ independent and sort of a bulwark of democracy. Everything from formal separation between DOJ and the White House in terms of communications. I talked about the ethics of recusal, that if an attorney has expressed an opinion on a case already publicly, he should be off the case. If an attorney has an interest in a case, he should be off the case. Those are normally observed norms, but not by Bill Barr. I talk about, I lay out 9 of them. But, one thing that really struck me is a lot of our institutions and our principles really come down to just the quality of the people who fill these jobs. I mean, an AG has enormous power, and AGs can use that power for good, or they can just use that power to promote their own agendas and to protect people who are their friends. And I think we just need better people who care more in these jobs. It sounds simplistic, but it's a reminder that just being the Attorney General doesn't imbue you with any magical abilities, right? You have a lot of power through the job, but it doesn't make you any different of a person. And so we need to just have people who are more dedicated to this line of work, and preferably because they lived it and learned it themselves. I argue in the book, one of Barr's shortcomings, not the only one, but one of his shortcomings is he never tried a case. He never learned the lessons the way I did and thousands of others did. So a lot of it just comes down to really simply how good our people are.
Evan, over to you.
Curious, what was the mood in the rank and file employees in justice and the attorneys general, and why weren't there more resignations? I was hoping there would have been mass resignations and protests in various departments during the worst excesses of the Trump administration, and I don't think we really saw that.
By and large, the mood of the rank and file always was when I was there, do your job. Keep your head down, do your job. You're so focused on your own cases, as you should be when you're an AUSA. You have 80 cases, 100 cases, 150 cases. I mean, generally, you're not worried about who the AG is. I had the luxury of never thinking about who the AG was. We'd get a memo once in a while or whatever, but it had no impact on me as a line level prosecutor. And that's how it should be. And that's sort of how it is for 99% of DOJ. I don't expect people to resign just because they disagree with what the AG is doing, or they think even if they think the AG is an outrage. Where we did see people resign, and like I said, in record numbers, 7 career prosecutors resigning off 4 cases, is where Barr intervened directly and undermined them directly on their cases. I think that's where I would draw the line. So I wouldn't resign just if Barr had no impact on my cases, but if he started meddling, then I think I would in that instance. But I will say, as resilient as DOJ's line prosecutors are, as much as we are trained to and do keep our heads down and do our work, morale really started to suffer under Barr. And I heard it from a lot of friends there who just said, this is really disgraceful. This is really embarrassing what this guy is doing, in a way that I'd never heard before when I was there or since.
Thank you for that question. You've reached over 4,000 people so far talking about your book, Hatchet Man. And I think this format suits you really well. You're not constrained to 2 or 3 minute sound bites. You can kind of go into the details. So we do this with every guest. What do you want to leave nearly 500 people with in the audience? It could be about democracy, it could be about DOJ, whatever. And it can be positive, negative, or somewhere in between.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to leave you all with this notion that DOJ is different. DOJ should be different. It should be independent. It should be its own thing. And I think we've seen even in the last week with the news, the power of DOJ to stop the worst excesses, to prevent the worst excesses of a president or other powerful people. So I do have faith that DOJ will get back on its feet. It's going to take time. It's going to take conscious effort, but I do have faith in that system. And people always ask me, will our democracy survive? I always say yes, but it takes work, like I said to one of the last questioners just now, and we can never take it for granted.
Well, that's all we have for you today. Huge thanks to Elie for coming out, and huge thanks to everyone in our community who's joined these conversations. Since we started doing this, almost 200,000 people have come to listen to us, speak with our guests who we invite, who are people in the news who otherwise you wouldn't get to speak with directly. After the conversations are over, we hang out with the audience sometimes for 2 or 3 hours, really processing and getting deep into what it was that we were talking about. We don't release those portions of the conversations here, but if you're curious about joining us to listen live, maybe ask one of our upcoming guests a question, if you want to hear past episodes, if you have feedback for us, good or bad, things you think we should do differently, please visit our website, pm101.club or pm101.live. They both work and will get you to the same place where you can find all that and more. This has been Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. On behalf of our co-founder, Justin Higgins, and our team, thank you very much for being here. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.